In cast correction section, this is where we apply the amount of correction that you want to your orthotic via refoot and then forefoot correction. But before we do that, you need to understand how we actually assess your cast and where we derive the correction from. So all scans are balanced to refoot 0 and all measurements are taken from refoot 0. What do we mean by that? Well, basically you can have a cast that is slightly pronated, or more than slightly pronated in this case. You can have a cast that is slightly supinated. What we used to do in the past is take the cast, pour it with plaster, then balance it out to refoot 0, and then add the correction that you've requested, whether it's 2, 3, 4, or 20 degrees. So all correction is taken from refoot 0 as shown on this slide. These days, the same cast is scanned looking from the refoot. It is then balanced, showing you how much forefoot supinatus or varus it had, and then the arch fill technique is then added once the cast is at refoot 0. This arrow here shows us approximately 90% of the height of the cast or the arch when the refoot is at 0. One thing to consider is that we give you 90% of the height of the arch, whether it's a mid-modified root or a modified root orthotic. Then when you add refoot correction to it, the arch height will increase by approximately 0.5 millimeter for every degree of correction, meaning that if you have a prescription of 0 degrees on the left foot and 4 degrees on the right foot will not only have 4 degrees of refoot correction, but it will also be 2 millimeters higher in the arch than the left foot. Forefoot correction is added in this section. Now, forefoot correction can be both varus or valgus, varus being plus or on the medial side, and valgus being minus or on the lateral side. Valgus forefoot correction is basically a lateral wedge to the orthotic shell. In this picture, we see how the lateral column is being followed with the plaster work, and now we've raised it, creating a forefoot valgus post of about 4 degrees. Under the varus section, we apply more pressure to the medial distal end of the orthotic. Again, in a mid-arch fill technique, the distal portion follows the first ray. By adding a 4 degree forefoot varus post, we're putting more pressure on the first ray, thus supporting a forefoot varus or a supinatus or a dysfunctional first ray. And this is an example of an actual positive mold and what it would look like. These changes were made intrinsically in virtual plaster work, and they're reflected in the shape of the orthotic shell. An extrinsic post can also be added to the forefoot. This is asked by simply writing extrinsic under the correction box. Here we have examples of extrinsic forefoot posts, valgus in the top left and varus in the bottom right. One thing to remember is that a forefoot extrinsic post will change the amount of refoot correction. Not very significantly, and the orthotic may rock slightly because the refoot and the forefoot are no longer aligned. But let's face it, when the patient is about 70-80 kilos or plus and they stand on that, it pretty much is insignificant. So to tie up forefoot posting, the main difference between intrinsic and extrinsic forefoot correction is that the intrinsic is done to the plaster work, whereas extrinsic is done to the shell after it has been molded, vacuum pressed or ground out. Generally speaking, most podiatrists will ask for extrinsic posting as an afterthought, where they need to change the shape of the orthotic when the patient comes back for a review. An intrinsic post will last much longer. Some podiatrists may think that it's more difficult to modify or easier to modify an extrinsic post, but that is not true. An intrinsic post can still be ground down and adjusted.